joining us today for our YRN 25th anniversary, part of XSC's 25th anniversary event series, Quo Vadis Europe. And we're really excited to get going. We have a great panel of speakers today, so I'm going to dive right into it. And that means, since I am speaking from London today, we'll go over to Ann-Kathrin to do our land acknowledgement today. So Ann-Kathrin, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lawrence, and welcome everyone. As we begin this event, we would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today with gratitude from the land of both the Quisapsan and Lokwangan families and ancestors. And as many of you are joining from around the country as well as the globe, I invite all of you just to pause and just ground yourselves and take a moment to just reflect on the way that Indigenous people celebrate and are resilient on around the world, as well as your own personal identity. So, Haishkasiyam. Thank you, Lawrence. Over to you again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ann-Kathrin, for the lovely land acknowledgement. So just a little bit of housekeeping right at the beginning. We're all familiar with Zoom webinars at this point, so I think this will mostly be standard stuff. Please refrain from using the chat function until after the speakers have completed their presentations. And when you do so, please remember to be kind and considerate and respectful. There will be Q&A time after each presenter presents. And then towards the end as well, we'll end with a group discussion. And if anyone wants to ask a question, you can do so by using the electronic hand raising feature. Or if you'd rather, you can also put the question in our chat, and one of our moderators will be nice to pick it up and sort of present that. Of course, please keep your mic muted during the presentations to minimize background noise. We encourage you to turn on your cameras just to create a bit more of a jovial sort of collegial atmosphere, but at the same time, of course, it's perfectly fine to leave your cameras turned off. And finally, please note that this webinar will be recorded and shared on our social media platforms and through our network afterwards. So just as a little bit of a disclaimer right at the beginning. And a quick run through our agenda. We're going to be working through some YRN welcomes right here at the beginning. And then our first keynote speaker is Athena Madan. And after Athena presents, there'll be a Q&A session, followed by Benjamin Prudhomme, followed by another Q&A session to address his talk. Then there will be a brief intermission, 5 minutes, if anyone needs to use the restroom or grab a drink of water. And then we'll move on to our young scholar presentations, specifically Fazila Mat and Amanda Leal, and then wrap up the event today with a Q&A for Fazila and Amanda, as well as for Athena and Benjamin, if there are any more questions, and just a general group discussion. So with all that said, and now I'm going to pass it over to Noah, who's kind enough to do our XSC/YRN introduction.
Yeah, exactly. Just a brief overview. So the YRN stands for the Young Researchers Network. We're an official entity of the XSC, which means the European Community Studies Association Canada. We exist since 2004, and our two main goals are really one's to connect young researchers in the European studies field across Canada, and second, to provide opportunities for the research, to present the research, for example, through the organization of essay contests, debates, webinars, and other events, just as we do here today. And in 2022, Ann-Kathrin, Lawrence, and we took over the board as the new co-presidents. And our big focus in our 2 years mandate is really to promote the multidisciplinary approach for the network, meaning to bring in and also to connect scholars from different disciplines who work on topics related to Europe. And yeah, this leads me to our personal introductions. So I'm Noah, I am 24. I did my bachelor's in political science at the University of Vienna in Austria. And I just finished my first year of my master's in European studies at McGill University. And I will pursue my second year at Sciences Po in Paris. And yeah, my research mainly focuses on social policy issues and especially on labor markets and unemployment. And in this context, I always try to apply an interdisciplinary as well as intersectional approach. And yeah, that's also the reason why I focus on the impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning on the working class in Europe in my master's thesis. Ann-Kathrin, up to you.
Thanks, Noah. And I'm just wondering if we can advance the slide deck by one slide. Thank you so much. So welcome again, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Ann-Kathrin McLean, and I'm a doctoral candidate here at Royal Roads University in Victoria, BC, Canada. My research focuses on understanding the relationship between collective memory, Holocaust remembrance, and a site of trauma. And I'm specifically interested to better understand how millennials and future post-war generations can become the next active witnesses for the future and a democratic and peaceful future around the world. And I just would like to extend again my gratitude to all of you for joining us today. And I look forward to discussing with you matters on European studies. Over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Ann-Kathrin, and thank you, Noah, for that broader introduction to XSC and YRN. Yeah, I'm Lawrence, and I got my bachelor's in history at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland and finished my master's in political science at the University of British Columbia in 2020. My research focuses on US politics, in particular the US presidency, but also Western European history and transatlanticism in particular, and foreign policy in particular. And I am very excited to be working with YRN, and I hope to pursue a career in foreign policy in the coming years, which is part of the reason why I'm so excited about these networking and yeah, just sort of building exchanges, opportunities like this. So that's us. And with no further ado, we'll get to the real stars of the show, starting, of course, with Professor Athena Madan. Thank you so much, our first keynote speaker. Athena is an assistant professor at Royal Roads University in the School of Humanitarian Studies, and she focuses on the social and political forces in health and long-term health outcomes. She's published a range of materials on these topics, including global health, therapeutic governance, international election observation, child soldier rehabilitation, really, a wide range of subjects. And she brings a wealth of international working experience as well, having worked with organizations all over the world, including Doctors Without Borders, the Carter Center, the United Nations Refugee Agency, and the World Health Organization. So we're really, really lucky to have her, and we're looking forward to her presentation. So with no further ado, Professor Athena Madan, over to you.
Thank you, Lawrence, for that introduction. And I was quite excited to hear all of the interests captured between yourself, Noah, and Ann-Kathrin. Ann-Kathrin, every time I hear you speak, I learn something new about you. So I'm just looking forward to connecting with you more frequently on these territories I'm dialing in, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from a territory just adjacent to Ann-Kathrin, the lands of the Songhees peoples in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. So I'm pleased to be with you, and I'm honored for this invitation. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see my slides, and then in the chat box, because I've discovered that with this particular platform, I'm putting in the chat box the link to my slides if you'd like to follow along online. It may appear quite small on your screen, but that's to facilitate my ability to advance the slides. So as I listened to your interest, I recognized that perhaps I just wanted to talk about other things, but I'm going to focus on what I prepared to present for you today. I recognize also, just to confirm the time with Ann-Kathrin and everybody. So what time would you like me to stop then? According to the agenda, to keep us to time, it's 11 or 10:50 that you'd like me to stop at?
Exactly, I would be around. Yeah.
10:50. Okay, sounds good. So I have more slides here that I'll be able to discuss. And so my idea in presenting some of my topics to you is to provide an interactive or dialectical approach to what you're interested in hearing about. I'm aware that in European studies, I come from an adjacent discipline when we're looking at humanitarian studies. When I look at issues of power, a lot of the legacies of colonization are at the heart of my work in the field of global health. And in this panel, I'd like to present some of the work that I've done in global mental health and what it means to decolonize particular institutional and disciplinary practice, which, if we are looking at the future of Europe right now in the humanitarian sector, Europe generally, or European countries, or Western European countries, are huge drivers of humanitarian aid, innovation, and funding. And so the sector in my world, at least when we're looking at the governance of the humanitarian sector, it is facing a racial reckoning, looking at the intersections of racial justice, climate justice, and social justice all at the same time. So I have some vignettes from my research methods that take up photoethnography and largely qualitative research methodologies. Here are some snippets that I'd like to share with you today. And one of the vignettes mentions Ayaskan duck language that we'll hear more about in just a few minutes. So if you do have any questions, I encourage you to put that in the chat box, and not just if that helps you pay attention or listen as we move forward throughout the time, not just at 10:50 break for the questions, but I welcome questions along the way. First, again, I would like to acknowledge that the Swepsum and the Songhees peoples, the lands where I reside, and if you've never been to Royal Roads campus, most of you have not, I'm assuming. My estimation in all the countries where I've lived and worked and played is that this is among the most beautiful campuses that I've ever had the pleasure of working on. And here is a tree that is something that I saw on my road, on my drive to work every day. So a bit of situating the research that I'll tell you about today, situating myself and my identities. I was born in the Philippines. I'm Indigenous or tribal Filipino. Most of our people tend to be very urbanized and very displaced now across the country, and I'm from the Visayas in this region. Most of the pictures that you'll see in this slide deck have been ones that I have taken. That is a very large part of my work, and as are my identities. So I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm the youngest of 7. We've also had sibling death. So I part of my own intergenerational story is not only that of my ancestors as they've been displaced as a result of forced colonization and a partition and diaspora, but also the losses of siblings as a result of many of those moves. I'm a partner, a mom to beings both pet and human, and I happen to also have received some awards as a result of the connections that I made at the university, for which I'm very grateful and which has also provided me the opportunity to be with you here today. So the discussion that I'd like to talk about, I'm sure many of you have heard about colonial legacies and epistemology, so I have a little bit of attention to that, and then vignettes from collaborating partners that demonstrate that impact, and then some new directions. For the purposes of time, I'll probably focus on discussion points 2 and 3, and then we can have some time together to discuss some closing thoughts. Knowledge at a glance, where we are in the School of Humanitarian Studies within the social sciences. The key point to this thought when we talk about where is Europe going now, recognizing that most of the typical knowledge or the knowledge production that exists in academic ways of knowing tends to be dominated by post-Enlightenment Anglo-European patriarchal thought, and that shapes the history and the experiences that are some of the calls that you'll hear today and some of the reflection points that I have. So recognizing that knowledge construction has not been historically neutral, and that if we are to look at facilitating a localization agenda in the humanitarian sector, which is where we are seeing multiple calls to facilitate a localization agenda, is also trying to understand how we might be able to deconstruct that knowledge and share power so that knowledge and different ways of knowing and relating and being could be equally recognized and documented and taking up space within the particular sector. So one brief map and to demonstrate where my discipline is shaped or how my discipline is shaped. So this map of countries represents those countries that contribute to the knowledge and global mental health research, which is what I'm presenting to you today. So as you can see, darker areas indicate higher numbers of studies. And as you look at this map, I'm sure that you would recognize that it seems mostly representative of countries in high income, highly politicized or highly politically organized countries, and mostly English-speaking countries for the most part. Point of departure on implementing global mental health. What I would like to just relate that is relevant to what I'm about to share is that more descriptive narratives are needed to understand mental health across cultures, and that mental health as a discipline tends to be dominated by discourses that originate in ways of knowing that are biomedical or that are looking at psychology in a particular way. And then when we look at scaling up within the funding landscape, funding study that I did last year talked about local conceptualizations being reflected in less than 6% of scaling up global health initiatives, which means that localization agendas or local knowledges are largely unrepresented in the pipeline. So I've got 3 minutes left, which I think is enough time to just cover one vignette. So these are all the slide decks that you can look at in your own, if you're interested in the future. But 3 areas. So first is conceptualizations of global mental health. The second is implementation, and the third is the impact of those. Is there one particular vignette or one particular area where I might share some vignettes that are of great interest to you, or of most interest to you who are attending today? You're welcome to put that, or I guess you aren't able to. I'm actually going to call, I recognize a name if I may. Jeanette Moritz, I taught someone with your name years ago. So if I may, I would like to ask you if there's one particular area you'd like to hear more of today. Would you like to hear more about conceptualizations? Would you like to hear more about implementation, or would you like to hear more about impact? And I'll just navigate to that slide as you might be able to demonstrate interest in.
I'll do, sorry, I'm in the car. Apologies. I'll go with, I think you said impact.
Impact, okay. And yeah, nice to see you. I'll just navigate to that slide, and happy car ride. I'll just have one vignette to share with you with the remaining time that we have. So these names have been anonymized, and this particular area that you'll be seeing comes from different areas around the world. So here's some key quotes that I'd like to highlight from this. Is from a beneficiary statement is, our suffering is a humanitarian fashion statement, and to overcome the mentality that we are beneficiaries is to relearn a new way of being and be in the world with confidence and get out of the trap of living in development. And that's the biggest obstacle, the mentality. So there needs to be a shift in the way funding is expected, and how funding has accountabilities. If the funding is accountable to beneficiaries or for the key stakeholders that are disconnected from the day-to-day lives of the people in the countries where the projects are funded. On treatment models, specifically in global health, in this key vignette, that our model seeks to promote local solutions, and again, facilitating the localization agenda, and grounding the treatment models in local knowledges and capacities is more important than making profit for a company whose leadership parachutes in here with their air-conditioned clothes. And one key point that we hear, at least in the Canadian landscape, is self-determination of Indigenous peoples. And this quote comes from someone who I worked with, who was a victim of the Rwandan genocide, and art therapy was a tool being used in this particular intervention or treatment center. And she says, there's nothing beautiful about the war in the country, or in my country. I don't want to draw a picture of things I don't want to see anymore. Sometimes I felt that they only want me to talk about what happens so that they, the white people, could feel better. Let me and my sisters, let us achieve hopes and dreams as equally as your own daughters. Only then will I be fine. Until then, I really don't want to draw. And the last point is on sustainability. In North America, we have a number of Indigenous communities that plan for sustainability 7 generations before and 7 generations after. And this particular beneficiary or stakeholder said, my responsibility is to my ancestors to ensure that the sustainability of my efforts are visible for 7 generations from now, and that I honor the contributions of those who preceded me 7 generations ago. So I recognize that that is all the time that we have. I've given you the slide deck if you would like to look at in your own time in the future. There are some new ways of moving forward that I think is important to highlight when we speak to decolonization, and I'll just go to the second slide. The most important thing that is at the heart of my work is the last point, making space for alternate knowledge paradigms. This includes ways of knowing and being and relating, or relationality, that is at the heart of any work that if you're doing global mental health work or global work in general, recognizing that the unborn is a key stakeholder that typically don't have airtime and that don't have the opportunity to share their knowledge or to share their aspirations. And equity is more important than any other outcome that is designed from a biomedical framework or from an institution where decisions and powers are held at a table that does not include those localized voices. So I thank you for the brief snapshot for my work. and insights that I've been able to learn from my friends across the world. The slide deck does tell you where some of the voices come from that formulate those recommendations, but I think my introduction also mentioned that I have diverse experience, which informs the heart of what I do. So we will soon be interrupted, I think, by my 2-year-old. So I'll pass the baton over to Ann-Kathrin if you'd like to ask some questions.
I just wanted to provide space for everyone who's in the room today to see if there's any questions at this point in time for Athena.
And I will just have a shout out. I think Jeanette, who I threw the baton to, is someone that I taught French to years ago in California. And it's so nice to see your face and hear your voice here today.
Just, if you don't mind, I would have a quick question. As somebody who also works mainly qualitatively and also with an ethnographic approach, you talked about where like the social science come from and like which countries shaped like kind of like the research nowadays. And I was just wondering which challenges you face, especially as a researcher who works qualitatively, who works with an ethnographic approach, compared to colleagues maybe at the faculty who work more like quantitatively with a more deductive approach. Like maybe you want to elaborate on that if they exist, and what tips would you give to like young researchers who want to, like depart from that predominant quantitative approach?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's only been in the past 2 years that I have felt the confidence in my work to have it stand alone, to not rely on those more empirical viewpoints. I think as an emergent researcher, I'm committed to emergent voices. I'm committed to underrepresented and largely marginalized or oppressed voices within the typical political spectrum. And that's easy in the humanitarian sphere, but in the medical sphere, not so much. So 2 things. One is sometimes numbers, you do need to include numbers as a qualitative researcher. So I always have descriptive statistics and I always have charts because numbers and graphs always mean something. So I consider my audience in that way. But I've also learned that qualitatively there can be impact. And I hope you've had a little snippet of impact that can help underpin meaning and equity that is so important when you're looking at this particular sector. In medicine, we look at lives saved, but sometimes we also need to look at lives improved and what is the quality and meaning of that improvement. So one thing that I've learned is with the qualitative research design, even if your research methods fail, quote unquote, or don't succeed in the way that you wanted to, because worst case scenario, people die. Best case scenario, something happens where you're not able to actually fulfill the parameters of that research project. Qualitatively, you still have a lot of data that can be very valuable. If you're doing empirical data or lab work, sometimes a failed experiment means you have no data. So you've lost however many months or years you've committed to that work. So I think that there is utility in qualitative data, even if there's limited generalizability, but you can leverage that targeted sample size to facilitate, or you can still convey meaning and urgency, hopefully, if you utilize the qualitative data correctly. And then ethnography, you brought up ethnographically. I think something when you're working with people, something that is very meaningful, especially in the current landscape when we're looking at social, political, and racial justice, the relationality that can be created specifically in qualitative research. So a lot of the photographs that I have embedded in my work is a way to demonstrate and process that relationality that is important to me. But I think also having confidence in those relationships that you build and recognize who you are in relation to that work is really important. I can open doors as a qualitative female researcher in ways that other people who don't look like me can't. I'm brown, so people who are brown will identify with me in a different way and in a more meaningful way than someone who is not. And as a woman, because I have perceived lack of social capital, people will tell me things that they wouldn't tell other people who they perceive to have positions of power. However, coming from a high income country where I'm a student and I have access to education, there's also a power dynamic that also should be respected and not exploited when you're undertaking qualitative field research. So there's a wealth of things to be cognizant of, I think, to underpin the value of qualitative research. And had I had more foresight in planning this topic, something that I actually thought about today is there's an article that I wrote about my work in Afghanistan that talked about very specific tensions about the value of qualitative work or the value of people's lives and stories. How do I, as a researcher, showcase these stories to a world that is kind of hostile and unwelcoming to a particular set of perspectives? And so that whole article is me processing over the years the pride that I now have in that work, but it took me some time to get there. So believe in your work, believe in the work that you're doing is important, even if the funding isn't always necessarily there. And even if the funding landscape wants you to do things that are not as, I worked for an agency where the funder wanted me to deliver chairs to a particular community in the DRC, the funding wanted me to deliver an organic garden to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo community, because they thought it would be valuable. But the community wanted chairs so that they could congregate, so they could sing songs and be together. And it created a huge back and forth between the funder and the researchers. And at the end, because we were bound to the community, we ended up delivering the chairs. It was not sexy by any means in the funding landscape. And we didn't get continued funding because we advocated for something like chairs and not a sustainable garden. But it's so important for that community to gather and to feel safe and to have that infrastructure. So those are the tensions that I think that will emerge, but just believe in yourself and the relationality that you build in the work. Thank you for that excellent question.
Thank you so much. That is really helpful and insightful.
And I see as well, we have this, a great question from Jeanette. I don't know if you can also see it, Athena, in the chat, and maybe you'd like to share on this sustainable decolonization approaches.
Yeah, I wish I had more time, and that is a great question. And I'm sure, Jeanette, you have experience also with your own work along the years. Sustainable decolonization approaches, I think, let me just re-highlight the last quote that I ended up with, looking at 7 generations before and 7 generations ahead of us. So at least changing the mindset that we don't need to work in 4-year election cycles, at least how humanitarian aid is funded in Canada, or our commitments as a Canadian citizen shouldn't necessarily be an extension of Canada's foreign policy. So recognizing that decolonization approaches need to work with an intersectional lens, that needs to work with a group of stakeholders that are committed and connected to the local communities themselves. And I would argue honoring the knowledges. A lot of intervention, whether it be in aid, medicine, or even education, ends up flowing always from the global north to the global south without any pipeline or without any ability within that pipeline to determine, can knowledge flow back up, a reverse innovation, if you will. So can there be innovation flowing from the local community to the communities that are making the decisions and constructing their designs? So that is one way, that is the key way to try to foster an equitable way to approach and deconstruct decolonization. Specifically with Indigenous peoples, I think a lot of times they wait to be consulted in a meaningful way, not just a way that has a checklist of, did you speak with the chief? Did you speak with the chief more than once? Did you have a feedback loop? Did you involve them in your talking, planning? Did you attend any of their ceremonies? Did you understand their ways? Do you understand what silence means? And a lot of times, a lot of people in the global north assume silence is acquiescence and is weakness, but in a lot of Indigenous communities, silence is resistance, and silence needs to be unpacked in order to fully understood to flow back up the pipeline, so that decolonization and so that self-determination can be enacted. So that's my answer in a brief nutshell to that question. Thank you also for that excellent question.
Thank you so much, Athena. I think you touched on a lot of, you kind of opened up the conversation, and it's really kind of refreshing to hear just the take you have on a lot of these issues and sort of opening up the problem of decolonization and knowledge production. And I really liked your answer on qualitative research in particular. And I actually have a question of my own to ask you, but I think hopefully we can come to that at a later point, because now we're joined by our next speaker, Benjamin Prudhomme, who we're very happy to welcome here. Benjamin is the executive director. Everyone can see the PowerPoint slides, I hope. sorry, I just want to make sure we get through the.
You can see them. We're on Athena's side right now.
Yeah, no, oh, okay, perfect. It just went through. Apologies for that. As I was saying, Benjamin is the executive director for AI for Humanity at MILA, the Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute. His research and work focuses on human rights, the international governance and regulation of AI, and the inclusion of marginalized communities in the life cycle of AI systems. And he has a background in law and has worked in various contexts, including as an advisor for the Canadian government, in academic institutes, and for nonprofit organizations. So again, we're very, very fortunate to have him here today. And Benjamin, over to you.
Thank you very much. I actually had prepared 2 slides. I normally don't prepare slides, but I made an effort. So do you want me to share my screen? But I guess you need to remove my face from there.
I think you should be the co-host already. So you start screen sharing.
So I'm going to be able, okay, great. Let me, there you go. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna, and okay, you're getting the irony of me being in this position, which is I think a lot about AI, but I'm actually really terrible at understanding how to use platforms. I guess I go. Okay, somebody needs to tell me on Zoom how to make it full.
I think in View, you just turn it to slideshow. You just had it there a second ago, but you might not be able.
No,
yeah,
I am.
Perfect. Yeah,
thank you.
Working fine.
So,
great.
Very briefly, just because people, surprisingly, I guess, because we're quite active and more on the international stage. But I always take the time to just introduce what MILA is, given that it's not as well known, at least here in Montreal and Quebec, but also because it's a bit of you'll see a funny beast between what would be a quote unquote normal university and a more tech transfer applied institute. So MILA is it's a community of about 1,000 researchers. The vast majority of them being really tech experts, specifically in deep learning. So it's the largest academic research lab in deep learning in the world. And I specify academic because when we talk about career later, there's that specificity about AI where actually industry, so the Microsoft, Google of this world, actually perform a lot of fundamental and applied research as well. And so we're the largest academic research lab, but there are far largest centers in the Microsoft and likes. Something that's very specific about MILA is that there are kind of 2 pillars, if you will, to our mission. So one is, of course, to be a global pole for scientific advances in AI, but the other one is for that to be socially beneficial or to the benefit of all. So there's a strong kind of value-based engagement, if you will, to the organization. And MILA is the result of a partnership between McGill and its affiliate institutions and Université de Montréal and its affiliate institutions. So we're not a university, we're a not-for-profit that hosts a bunch of researchers in their labs. But this means that we do have a mandate that resembles universities, like really kind of supporting or propelling research. But we also have a mandate that is more around kind of upskilling the AI ecosystem, making sure that the tech transfer towards industry is made in a responsible or ethical way, and kind of altogether dynamizing, if you will, the AI ecosystem nationally. And so the last thing is, few people know MILA, but a lot of people know Yoshua Benjo, who's our research director. So we always put his face there. Yoshua was the Turing Award winner in 2019, I believe, which is the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. And most of his research is devoted to using fundamental AI research for socially beneficial purposes, particularly in the domain of climate and health. Move. Then very briefly, I am the executive director of the AI for Humanity team, which has really kind of 3 big pillars or streams of work. The first one is applied AI projects, so really tech projects, but instead of being for a bank or for another institution, they're specific to social challenges. So we have AI against modern slavery, AI against human trafficking, etc. The second piece is ethical AI, and that's a lot actually of the conversation we're hearing about AI. So everything around algorithmic bias, discrimination, and fairness. So in a nutshell, how do you make sure that as you're building AI systems, you are not specifically targeting, either targeting or underrepresenting marginalized communities, so that it impacts them when the model is deployed. And the last piece is about public policy and learning. And there we're really working with most international organizations like the Global Partnership on AI, UNESCO, the UN, the OECD, around how to create a regulatory framework to ensure the responsible development of artificial intelligence. I am going to stop sharing, and I am going to then enter really into the questions that you've asked, which is, what is one promising research thematic that I think that I'd love to speak to you about? And then some kind of practical questions around what I'm looking for when I'm hiring, and you know, what's the landscape in AI looking like? So in terms of research question, there's quite a few that I thought about, and it's interesting because I don't know your backgrounds, and I'm sorry I was not there at the beginning. So I went for AI governance. So I want to talk to you in kind of 5 minutes in terms of what is AI governance, what are the kind of questions that we ask there, and what are the kind of, in my view, pressing mandates that someone could take on if they wanted to get involved in that space. So the first thing is, think of AI governance. So a lot of people do kind of the equation between AI governance and AI regulation. AI regulation is a part of what AI governance is, but AI governance is larger than that. So AI governance is really kind of, if you ask the question, what should be the mechanisms that we put in place at different levels? So it could be local, national, international, or regional or international, to ensure that we are building an environment that in a way that forces AI to be both developed and deployed in responsible ways. So if I said that kind of more concretely, how do I make sure that the framework, that I put forward is one that forces industry to put forward unbiased models, or that, you know, that ensure that we're not kind of further deepening the tech divide between the global north and the global south. So there's all sorts of questions that come into play there. And I chose that question first because it's the one that I work most on. I particularly work at the international stage, and particularly in AI regulation. So the question that I deal with the most is, how should we be regulating AI at the international level? But there are many other questions, and I think what's interesting about AI governance is that that's a space that mobilizes deeply interdisciplinary knowledge and both scholarship and activism. So you need tech people. You need tech people to understand, very particularly in the building of legislation. You need people that support you in making sure that the kind of obligations that you're envisaging in a way resonates with the tech community. So I'll give you a very concrete example. A lot of people are advocating for what we call explainable algorithms. So being able to say, this algorithm took a decision for you, here is why it took that decision. The problem with that is it's technically impossible today. We're unable to explain an individual decision from an algorithm. So here what we need is someone technical to say, maybe explainability doesn't look like this in the context of algorithmic justice. Maybe it looks more like that. This is what we're able to do technically today. And maybe that's what you want to embed in your legislation, so that in fact, you're creating obligations that you're going to be able to kind of enforce afterwards. So there's a huge space for tech, but then there's also a huge space for social sciences and, well, legal scholarship, quite obvious if you're talking regulation. But there's also a lot of space for political theory, political science, sociology, just in terms of understanding how certain legislation, so we call it effectiveness of legislation. So how do certain pieces of legislation operate? How do they impact industry? Are they working or not? Are they advantaging a certain part of the population, whether it's global, not global south, the global south, sorry, or within one jurisdiction? Is it, is it a piece of legislation that's going to be far more favorable to companies instead of marginalized communities? So you can already see that those questions need, unfolding from economists, from political scientists, from sociologists to measure and then advise. What I particularly work on, I just want to make sure that somebody's going to flag me the time. I'm assuming someone will. Okay. So what I particularly work on is the question of what legal foundation we should be advocating for when we're talking about AI regulation. And if I kind of summed it up, there's really two big schools of thought. The first one is we should be founding AI governance on ethical principles like fairness, accountability, transparency, etc. And in that school of thought, which I would say, unfortunately for me, because I'm part of the second one, but has been the dominant one for the past few years. And you've seen with that a plethora of ethical declarations that came to life. There's about 170 today at the national or international level, which give or take, which are quite consensual in terms of the principles they're putting forward. So one school of thought is, how do we kind of induce from those declarations consensual principles that we could enforce? The other school of thought is the International Human Rights Framework. So in a nutshell, saying we actually already have certain legal instruments that have set very clear obligations that are kind of agnostic to the nature of question, whether we're in AI, whether we're in mining companies, or whether you're government. These have been deemed to be kind of the foundational human rights and freedoms that we think ought to be respected. And so that second group of thought is proposing something that's a little more kind of top bottom. So we're not suggesting to kind of to start thinking about new legislations and ways of regulating AI, but rather using existing pieces of law and infrastructure and institutions, but making sure that as we advance within both the jurisprudence and the legal texts, we're more and more aware of the way that AI operates. Because of course, discrimination is not operating the same way if you're looking at a data set than if you're looking at a 1950 question of discrimination, like is there discrimination about a certain community in accessing school? It becomes more complex, it becomes more interdisciplinary. You need to have tech knowledge to be able to really understand it. So I would stop there because I was asked for 15 minutes. And I think it's been 15 minutes. There was a set of kind of more informal questions in terms of, what am I looking for when I hire and et cetera. My suggestion, I'll answer just one of those in 30 seconds, and the rest I would leave for questions instead so that it's actually relevant for you. So the only reason why I wanted to answer that specific question about what I'm looking for when I hire is that I think I have a different answer than a lot of people, but I think it's an answer that hopefully is going to grow within people that hire in the coming years. But really, I'm of course looking for expertise. So if you're not interested in AI, likely you're not going to apply to my team. But once we're past that, what really I'm looking for is actually someone, I'm looking for lack of ego, collaboration, and kind of a strive to continue deepening your knowledge. So we're an institution at Mila where we have certain of the best brains in the world. And so the pace at which the science of AI evolves is just crazy. And so what I'm looking for is really people that understand that as a team, we're going to be probably far more capable of ingesting, if you will, that level of advancement, and that the projects we could build together are likely to be far more impactful than if my 5 people work in silos. So it's really, and frankly, it's half of my interview processes is around measuring ego and capacity to work constructively in teams. So things like being able to provide and receive feedback, ways in which you continue to learn as you go, ways in which you present, seek partnerships. So that's really one of the core things I'm looking for. I'm going to stop there and respond to questions if there are any.
I thought that was a really amazing talk. Thank you very much, Benjamin. I just had a really quick question that I was thinking about focusing on Europe, if I may, for a second, because I think Europe is sort of in an interesting place, at least from my admittedly, amateur perspective, I suppose, because I don't study AI issues. But when it comes to AI and then regulating big tech companies, I feel like Europe's in this interesting place where it's sort of on the cutting edge of trying to cut back what big tech, the influence of it, and trying to regulate it and control it, and sort of being more skeptical of a lot of those privacy issues and those ethical issues. While at the same time, a lot of European countries talk about, as the 21st century progresses, being more tech savvy. We heard a lot of this rhetoric around Brexit about like, oh, our economy will be fine because we'll just be so innovative, and we'll build everything around tech and AI, and that's sort of where our niche will be as the years go on. So I'm not suggesting that's necessarily a contradiction, but I was just curious of what you think, and particularly what institutes like Mila, where they situate Europe in this landscape that you were previously describing.
Yes, no, that's a very good point, and that's why I should be making slides. I actually took that topic because it's particularly, I was asked to pick a topic that's relevant to Europe, and that is one. So frankly, I think Mila sees Europe like the whole rest of the world, which is in that specific space of AI governance. Europe is by far the leading body internationally. It's the only body that's been putting forward a project of binding law. It's already adopted one, the GDPR, which I'm sorry, I don't recall what it stands for, the GDPR, but it's really like the big piece of legislation around kind of how do we approach artificial intelligence? Are we doing a risk base? Are we doing consent, etc.? And now it's looking at a new bill specific that would be binding as well to all its countries around specifically to artificial intelligence. And so I'm in disagreement with quite a lot of the ways in which Europe is approaching some of these issues, but I don't think this call is going to allow to go in depth in this. But what I think is of particular value in terms of studying this at this moment in time is that because Europe took leadership, regardless of whether you agree with them or not, they are in a way shaping, they're very much shaping the way that we're approaching AI governance beyond Europe. So really, there's one international organization, UNESCO, which came out very recently with, they call it the Recommendation on AI Ethics, which is non-binding. And then you have some sets of principles and assessments that come out of the OECD as well. But generally speaking, there's no legal instrument in the world that's gone as far as what Europe has done in terms of fleshing out what those obligations could be. So in a way, although I disagree with some of the approaches they've taken, I think that there had to be a body, like I think there had to be a body that really kind of came up with a project of legislation and just moved ahead. And I think perhaps regardless of my disagreement with it, I think that the biggest added value of the way that Europe has been conducting itself is just showing that the narrative around it's impossible to legislate the space of tech is actually false. You can legislate the space of tech. You can do it in different ways, and then we can agree and disagree that it's the right one, but you can do it, and Facebook is not going to stop operating in Europe. You're going to enter, and there is where political theorists, by way of example, would be great, but you're going to enter a different kind of conversation around negotiating the terms of those obligations, negotiating how they unfold into court. But really, Europe has been the only one taking that stance so far. So it's an extraordinarily rich field to be studying at this point. And if Europe get it right, they're really making us all a favor by just paving the way and showing it's possible to get tech companies under binding obligations.
If I may, thanks so much. Just to jump in briefly, we have Amanda here as well, who is one of the young scholars, and she also works on artificial intelligence, actually. And she will be talking a lot about those issues that Benjamin just has said that he won't go much into detail. So we're very happy to have Amanda here, and she conducted interviews with a lot of experts. So yeah, just to give you a little preview for after the break afterwards, like I think we're going to have a lot of interesting things to talk about.
I think we have time for one more quick question from Ann-Kathrin before we then take a quick intermission and then go to our young scholar. So Ann-Kathrin.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for your presentation, and it was really informative to learn a little bit about the work that you do and artificial intelligence in that realm. And I have a question regarding, I believe, one of the pillars that you spoke about. I think you mentioned ethical AI, and that kind of also links to one of the two schools of thought that you addressed. And I'm wondering if you have, and I know you touched on it a little bit, but just some more specific examples how you can use this particular pillar to support equity, diversity, and inclusion in the just landscape of AI.
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, so within that pillar of ethical AI and ethical declarations, one of the consensual principles, it comes up with different language in every declaration, but really the core of it is around fairness and representativeness. And so that is, I would say that is where, that's where the space or the conversation of equity, diversity, and inclusion comes in. And as part of that fairness conversation, there are kind of substreams of work or questions. So very often companies will limit that question to the diversity of the team working on a specific application, which in my view is important, but very insufficient. So there's that question of diversity of members working in AI. And there is the whole conversation around the fact that women are, representing somewhere between 20 to 25% of the AI workforce and how that induces biases. So representativity, there's a question of technical fairness. And so we have a prof here that actually Amanda worked quite closely with, Gulnush Fanadi, who's specialized only on this. How do you technically code fairness? How do you make sure that certain applications, and you can see there's a little bit of a collision here between privacy, which would require, if you take it to the, to the utmost level, in a way, I should not be able to know, are you a Black person? Are you a woman? I should kind of be agnostic to who you are. But at the same time, I would like my model to not be biased and not be discriminatory. And in order to do that, I need to make sure that my data set fully captures the kind of users. It's going to be, if I'm deploying a data set for poor areas of a certain city, and that area is mainly inhabited by X community, then I should make sure that my data set represents that community. So there is the whole question of how do you reconcile specific ethical conflicts technically. And then there's another question that touches upon AI governance that's in fairness as well, which is how do you meaningfully include marginalized communities or members of marginalized communities within the life cycle of AI, really from day one, like from starting to ideate a project, all the way to collecting the data, annotating the data, training the model, deploying it. So what are the ways in which you can make sure that, you're not just representing them in the data, but you're actually really building inclusive models? So that's the piece that everything around fairness in AI and EDI in AI would be the two pieces that I guess that I would invite you to, to think about.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. So I think now we'll just have a quick 5 minutes. Thank you once again, Ben, for your time. And then we'll progress to Fazila and Amanda to share their experiences and perspectives. And so, yeah, I would say we're taking 5 minutes now, and then we'll start back up around 11:30, give or take. So, yeah.
Great. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you very much, Benjamin.
Bye.
I'll start screen sharing for the slides, I think.
Oh yeah, true, of course. We need to bring in Fazila's slides. Thank you, Noah. Perfect, and we're all back. Yes, so just hand it over to Fazila then. Hi, thank you again for being here, Fazila. Fazila is a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria in political science. After having gotten her MA in humanities at the University of Milan, she has over 10 years experience working with press and media in Italy and Switzerland. So we're very excited for that professional insight, and also her research interest focuses on democracy, populism, authoritarianism, media relations, and then also EU-Turkey relations in particular, which I gather is one of the things Fazila is going to be talking to us about today. So over to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate very much your help with the slides. So just 1 second, please. And here we are. Okay, thank you very much for having me here today for this invitation. And it's been a pleasure to listen to the previous presenters. And my presentation today is gonna focus primarily on my tentative research project, and I'm gonna try to connect this with my professional experience as a journalist, and also maybe trying to share with you some insights as a young researcher and being in Canada and studying European affairs. So the presentation today is called Populism in Turkey under the AKP rule. And for those who are not maybe familiar with the AKP, is the Justice and Development Party in Turkey, who has been ruling the country since 2002. So first of all, one thing that we might like to ask, I mean, why populism? Why studying populism? The fact that is, as you know, in recent years, populism emerged as one of the distinctive features of contemporary politics in several countries in the world. And some countries that have been affected by this trend are well-established liberal democratic traditions, like the US and many other countries in the world. And the European countries are no exception to this trend. In Europe in particular, for example, we see prevalently a type of what has been labeled as an exclusionary populism. And the economic and financial turbulences of the last decade and the recent crisis of the European Union so-called refugee crisis have given rise to nationalism as well as populism and a nation-first agenda, while shaking the very foundation of the European integration. And within this broader picture, Turkey represents a particular case, and I'm going to illustrate now briefly in what sense. But first of all, let me give you just a few definitions in scholarly literature of how populism is being defined. So in the literature, we basically find three main definitions of populism. Populism as a strategy, as elaborated by Kurt Weiland. Populism as a discursive form, as studied by Ernesto Laclau. And finally, populism as a team-centered ideology, so a weak ideology, as elaborated by Cas Mudde. But apart from that, and we can go to the other slide as well. Populism have also right and left-wing features. And here, I'm mainly interested in the right-wing populism. which has some very specific common features. So first of all, this type of populism is based on discourses that divide society into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps. These are the pure people and the corrupt elite. Roger Brubaker suggests that populism entails, in fact, two dimensions. One vertical dimension, where we see the contraposition between the pure people and the corrupt elite, but also a horizontal dimension where the opposition is between insiders and outsiders. And this also includes internal outsiders. So this connects very well to the fact that we see populist actors creating constantly and demonizing out groups like minorities, migrants, dissidents, and opposition parties and politicians. So populism in this sense is based on an anti-pluralist and majoritarian discourses, and that construe diversity as a threat to social cohesion. And so, again, why studying populism in Turkey? I guess this is also where also my personal experience comes in, because I think that it's particularly important to study Turkey's case as an example that shows how a populist party, the AKP in this case, can achieve power claiming to democratize a country and end up dismantling almost all of its democratic mechanisms and establish an authoritarian regime in the end. While claiming at the same time to set the foundations of a native democracy. So a democracy that has completely renewed its fundamental values and beliefs. So with regards to my work, my past work as a journalist, and their relationship to my doctoral research in this respect. So because I was born in Turkey, but at the same time I lived and worked for many years in Italy as a journalist covering Turkish politics for the Italian media. So this gave me a perspective to see things that were happening in Turkey from an outsider view while being still an insider. And I guess this is a valuable thing to remember also as a researcher, because it's always important to keep some sort of distance with the object of your study while still being in a way included in the dynamics that interest what's happening in your country at the same time. So I had the luck and the chance and the opportunity to interview many people in those years. And I also witnessed the change that was taking place within the local media in Turkey. And I have witnessed, and very sadly, the transformation of this country from the mid-2000s towards these days. The transformation that saw the country becoming gradually less liberal, always closing up upon itself. And while using these dichotomies and these binary divisions in the populist discourses put in place by the country's leaders. So, and in this regard, one thing that I've been following very closely while I was working as a journalist was the Turkey-Europe entanglements and the Turkey-EU relationship. Just to give you a brief content on this, Turkey has been aspiring to become a part of the European integration process for over 50 years. And so between Turkey's EU membership candidacy in 1999 and the launch of accession negotiations in 2005, several reforms were adopted, and they were fundamental in Turkey's democratization. And these reforms were adopted and implemented by the same government ruling the country today. So here we have a paradox in this sense. But what happened is that after the promising initial phase of reforms, there appeared a number of obstacles, and I'm not going to be able to talk about these today, but Turkey's EU candidacy as it is now, it's overall, but nominally. So Turkey is still officially a candidate country to become a member of the EU, but the negotiations are frozen, and there is a halt to hold the process at this time. So giving this background, what are the elements and means leading to the populist framework in Turkey? So I have identified three elements, and these are the polarization and binary constructions, the moral dimension, and the role of the media. So if we look at the polarization and binary construction element, we can, first of all, we can see that the polarized politics and discourse by the AKP leaders have been a constant feature since the AKP's foundation. So even when the AKP wanted to join the EU and was democratizing the country, if we analyze the discourses that appeared on the media at this time, we always see that there was this kind of construction where there were the enemies of the people and the rightful side, so the people represented by the AKP itself. But within this frame, Europe was still depicted as a friend, so it was not on the side of the enemies. While in time this has changed, as we're going to see. The AKP presented itself as the guardian of the people, and its framing of the society was the party and its constituents were represented as the one and only native and national political force. By contrast, all the other political classes that uphold Western paradigms, including the old elites of the country and their constituents, have started to be depicted and are still depicted as non-native and as enemies of the independence of democracy that the AKP, of course, claims to vanguard. The AKP, through its populist discourses, managed to capitalize on the people versus the old elites, the Kemalist elites. This at home, whereas abroad, they use the rising anti-Islamist civilizationist narratives in Europe to, again, perpetuate this kind of discourse. And as we're going to see better in the moral dimension of the framework, this has had a number of implications. The second element, the moral dimension of AKP's populist framework, is one of the driving themes of AKP's exclusionary politics discourses. And these discourses revolve around an implicit moral superiority of the people, the national and native nation, compared to the elites and the perceived outgroups. So in most recent years, the refugee issue has become a constitutive component of the AKP identity and a discursive tool to claim moral superiority over its political opponents at home and in Europe. Because Turkey has brought in over 4 million Syrian refugees, while Europe closed its doors towards them. So this has become a political tool for the AKP to claim this kind of moral superiority. So what does it mean? So that while the civilizationist populist discourse found in the Western countries is very much infused with anti-Islamic discourse, in the Turkish case, the same civilizationist populist discourse depicts the West as a social order that is inherently exclusionary and unjust and immoral. This brings me to the role of the media and the third element here. One should say that populist discourses in Turkey progressed in tandem with the capture of the media by the Turkish authorities. And at least there have been identified at least 3 ways of media capture in Turkey. Through the creation of private media by companies with ties to the government, through financial sanctions targeting opposition media, and through the intimidation and criminalization of journalists. So as of now, around 70% of the country's media belongs to 4 companies that are close to government. I would say even more than 70% of the media. So as politics has become increasingly mediatized in Turkey as well as in other parts of the world, the role of the media becomes more important in political process, overlaying and subsuming political logic. And this aspect is overly amplified in a case like that of Turkey, where the media is captured.
Just wanted to say 1-minute warning. Thank you.
I'm finishing. And studies have shown that not only can popular media have an indirect instrumental role, but they can also act as primary players in promoting a populist agenda. Final reflections. Okay, so obviously, against this very dense and vast background, there can be a number of research questions, and I'm happy to talk about these maybe in the Q&A section. But I'd like to finish the presentation with a little final reflections about studying Europe in Canada, where obviously it's the first obstacle for me personally has been the fact that Canada is so far away from Canada physically. But there have been also a number of opportunities that I found, especially in the university where I'm studying at the University of Victoria, and its European Studies department, working with scholars, excellent scholars that teach and study and work on projects that allow me to still be close to the European aspect, as well as I'd like to also to mention the UCANET network. It's a platform where there are implemented projects dealing with European issues. At the same time, the ecstasy community and where we're today now, that has given me the opportunity to see that even in a place as vast as Canada, it's possible to still be connected with other scholars and find connections and still be close to Europe despite the physical distances. So I finish here my presentations, and thank you very much for your patience. I've been a little bit too long, but looking forward for your questions. Thank you.
Not at all, Fazila. Thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. And every time I hear you talk about your research, I learn one more thing to like about it. And we'll obviously have a time for questions after Amanda's presentation. So I'll just pass it over to Amanda. Do you have slides you're going to be using, Amanda?
Yes. Let me share.
You should be able to share your screen. And I'll just say for everyone else, Amanda is a young Brazilian lawyer and researcher with a background in politics, law, and artificial intelligence. She's currently pursuing her master's in political science at the University of Montreal, and she is affiliated through her studies with the Canada Research Chair for Electoral Democracy, as well as the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship. And she also does work with the Mila Institute. So again, another fantastic guest, and we're happy to have her. So please, Amanda, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Okay. Thanks so much for the invitation, Noah, and thank you for the co-presidents for organizing this panel. Super cool. So basically, I'm going to talk about the democratic governance of AI, and I'm going to talk about my interdisciplinary approach to it. So my objective is to share, first I'm going to share a little bit of my research experience and how I ended up in this field. And then to illustrate the importance of this field and hopefully inspire you to research about it too, I'm going to talk about the specific topic of democratic governance. I'm going to use an example about AI ethics in the industry. And I hope the takeaway of my presentation is going to be that building a democratic governance of AI will demand more interdisciplinary research and more international cooperation, and then that we can translate this into concrete policies and regulations. So to jump into the theme of the panel, first of all, I wanted to situate my talk into the subject of like, where is Europe going? And I pull up all my Latin from my law school years to tell you that wherever Europe is heading, it will require strong international cooperation because it's going with the world, you know. And that's why I'm even happier to be here with you as, you know, a Global South, specifically Brazilian researcher, and to share, you know, experience, but also to shed light on issues that will relate to Europe and will relate to the rest of the world too. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about my background, and I divided in 3 parts to explain where I'm at the moment. First, I hold a bachelor's degree in law in Brazil. And even before starting my law degree, I knew that I wanted to work at this international, interdisciplinary, and dynamic setting. So I was always seeking opportunities to work at the intersection of law and anything else, you know, like every other domain. Then I had the chance during my undergrad to participate in the Erasmus Mundus program. Maybe some of you were part of it too. And I studied political science at Sciences Po Grenoble for a year in France. And there I had a seminar about the Arab Spring. This was back in 2016, 17. It was still fresh. We were still seeing the results of it. And it was focused on the democratic transition in Tunisia. Now, you've all heard about the Jasmine Revolution of 2011 and how social media was this major enabler for civic engagement and democracy, basically. And that's where I got interested in the technology's impact on democracy. And this became like a main research focus for me. And then in 2017, I went back to Brazil to finish my law degree. And on a less hopeful note, in 2018, I actually witnessed the negative impacts of technology for democracy. We had very polarized elections in Brazil, presidential elections in 2018. There was a huge wave of disinformation, of hate speech online. And so I started looking into how AI-powered algorithms in social media and automated disinformation campaigns were affecting democratic processes, but this time in a bad way. And that's how AI came into play in my life. Then upon graduating, I took the bar exam, and then I started a research fellowship with the Institute of Technology and Society in Rio. It's called ITS Rio. It's a research institute focused on this intersection of technology, law, and political science, all that. And I was focusing on democracy and technology topics, more specifically, media and information literacy, policies and regulations to fight disinformation, still in this context of electoral processes. And then to continue this research path and knowing that I wanted to dive deeper into this intersection of this interdisciplinary field, I went for a political science master's at University of Montreal. And I chose Montreal because of the AI hub, and you know, it's one of the most important in the world. I bet Benjamin told you more about it. And then at the beginning of my master's in March 2021, I got an internship at Mila, and I'm still working there. I started with a project about the gender gap in the AI industry. And now I'm in other projects focused on the societal impacts of AI and AI ethics. So basically right now I'm at the center of this intersection, very basic slides, like I hope we could have a chalkboard. So I try to replicate that. I'm at the center of it, and this is such a vast field, but I wanted to illustrate some opportunities in this field by focusing on one example. So just to quickly draw a map of this space and share some insights about some of the research I did. I'm gonna talk to you about the AI ethics, specifically how it plays out in the industry. So at the crux of the development of AI, there are challenges about the foundations in which AI systems are built. On the one hand, I'm talking about the data, the algorithms, the basis of the foundations of AI. And then you have other challenges that come from unforeseeable outcomes when you deploy AI in the real world, because it is built in this very limited universe, in this void, this vacuum, and then you can only predict so much, and you end up seeing outcomes of this interaction between AI and the environment. So the challenge here with AI ethics is to guarantee, usually we say, a fair, accountable, transparent, and ultimately ethical AI system. And to achieve this, we need to consider different layers of the intersection of AI with society. And then I hope that we can fine-tune these intersections of AI with policies, with regulations, and with other domains, so we can mitigate risks and have AI that benefits society. So my point here is that AI governance is time sensitive. The problem is that because AI models play an increasingly prevalent role in our lives, changing the way they work will only become harder, And we've all heard of reports of how these systems reproduce discriminatory behavior. And all these reports, they just show how biases can become deeply embedded in the AI pipeline. So from the creation, the design of the AI system to the deployment and the maintenance of the system. Now, the thing about the democratic governance of AI, in my perspective, is to overcome this moving fast and breaking things paradigm, which currently, rules how technology is developed. And because the thing about developing technology at this fast pace, it's still void of regulations, as Benjamin mentioned briefly, and still limited social constraints because we're still learning about it, is that actually, as it develops so quickly, the negative consequences of AI, they can end up mining social trust in technology, for example, and disrupting important landmarks like democracy and electoral processes. But I had the chance to research more about the societal impacts of AI. And one of my main concerns was really interviewing AI experts and practitioners to see their point of views and to understand from their insider perspective what were the major blind spots in the AI industry that were hindering AI ethics. And just to name a few of the most recurrent themes, they always mention this lack of unified metrics, fairness metrics more specifically. Benjamin also mentioned quickly that fairness is approached both in a mathematical way and in a social way. So it's also a mathematical concept where you're able to measure fairness. But we have different definitions of it all over the place, and we still don't have unified metrics and unified definitions. Then another point is lack of diversity, and lack of diversity more specifically in decision-making in the industry at large. So if you think about the corporate decision-making in the C-suite, we see it's very homogeneous. We don't have diversity. And then if you look into the political side too, we don't have diversity among the people that make those decisions about how AI is going to shape our future, how it's going to develop. And even with the developers of the technology, there's still a lack of diversity among the researchers and among the developers. And then the third point is lack of ethical standards. As Benjamin mentioned, very recently we had the UNESCO AI recommendations for AI ethics. It is one example, but we still have much work to do on this front. So basically, these are some of the major challenges. But I also asked researchers about, how can we move towards a better scenario for AI so we can benefit society at large? And it should come as no surprise at this point that, their answers didn't revolve around technical solutions. They were actually revolving around a democratic governance of AI. So if you think of broader participation, this means including more diversity and a broader pool of stakeholders throughout the pipeline when there's decisions to be made about how AI is going to impact society. And it's the old talk about including all stakeholders in the decision table. And then the second point is basically to achieve this broader participation, we need awareness raising about AI governance and AI impacts. And then to get to this point, we also need to broaden the access to ethics-based AI education and create this pool of people, all society being able to approach this subject and help design and decide how technology is going to be deployed in society. So it was really interesting to see that even within the industry, within the academia, from the people that sometimes we perceive as, this AI bubble, they're already conscious, at least the people I talked to, and they were from AI ethics, so it's normal that they would have this perspective. But we know that there is a demand for more democratic governance of AI. So how can we young researchers contribute to AI democratic governance? We need to improve participation, we need to level the playing field for all stakeholders, and we need to expand this interdisciplinary field of research. And then it comes the most important part, actually, which is translating this knowledge into concrete policies, regulations, and organizational reforms. So just to conclude, this is just the blind spots that I mentioned, the solutions that I mentioned, the possible ways forward that I mentioned. They're all a sneak peek into a chapter that I co-wrote with Professor Golnoush Farnadi that Benjamin mentioned. She's a professor at Mila, and Rebecca Salganik, a researcher in AI ethics. For this upcoming book, it's called Missing Links in AI Governance. It's going to be launched in September. It's a joint publication between Mila and UNESCO. So if you're interested in the topic, please take a look at it. And we can connect through LinkedIn, and I'll make sure to let you know when it's out. So thank you so much. And just to wrap up, I just wanted to say that I hope to keep contributing to these efforts in research, maybe, hello, maybe do a PhD in this topic, but always balancing research and policy work, because I think where we're at right now, we're going to need very strong evidence-based policy to really achieve AI's full potential and benefits to society. So thanks so much for this space, and I hope to keep discussing in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was another really, really great talk, and particularly nice to how you sort of touched on and then really built on ideas that Benjamin introduced and brought your own perspective as a young researcher. So thank you for that. Now, yeah, I would just open it up to the group for any questions anyone might have for Amanda or for Fazila. Yeah, so please, whoever would like to go first.
Maybe I'll kick us off with a practical, pragmatic question. I mainly for you, Fazila, because I heard you speaking and touching on this a little bit during your presentation, but Amanda, I would like to extend the invitation to you as well from a researcher's and young scholars perspective to jump in afterwards, if you like. So Fazila, you were talking about that you yourself, while you were working as a journalist in Italy, were an internal outsider, right, when you were reporting on the media. And I'm just wondering, for maybe our young scholars are interested to see what might be some best practices in that situation to be aware of your assumptions and your personal bias when you are such an internal outsider in a research scenario.
Thank you for the question, Ann-Kathrin. That's a hard question because how would you know? You have to try to be as much as reflective as possible because obviously you have your biases, you have your political views, and the thing is that in certain contexts, and I guess this is the experience of many journalists in Turkey. At some point, when you're trying to cover the stories, you have to be very careful about the questions that you ask, because the situation of freedom of expression has become so dire that even a question that you ask, not even a thing that you declare, might lead you to jail. And so I guess there needs to be a whole different sets of reflections, because on the one hand, you have to be truthful, but at the same time, you have to be also very careful about your incolumity in that case. So I guess Turkey's case is a little bit particular in this respect, but in general terms, I guess it's very important. It's a great opportunity to be able to travel and to experience new contexts. For example, since I arrived in Canada and I started to study here, I have seen a whole different way of approaching to democracy, and with all its contradictions and all the challenges also that are there. So that has been a great opportunity to reflect even more about my positions about democracy. So what you think that democracy is, sometimes it's not even so well shaped. It's something that evolves. So I guess the important thing is to keep this evolution flowing and going on, because it's never giving once and for all. So keep the window open and let the air come in. I guess that would be my advice to researchers, young researchers, and young professionals.
Thank you, Fazila.
Athena, you have a question or a point?
I did, thank you. And I just wanted to, let me lower my hand. I wanted to ask a question for Amanda. I loved your presentation, and you ended by saying that you wanted to pursue a doctoral degree after all of this. So first, my question is practically, do you have a supervisor for your work? Are you seeking supervisors? And second, just curious if you could tell us the journey, how you came to formulate your recommendations, because it sounded like there was a longer story there that informed that. And then I also see that there's a lot of the common threads between all of the discussions I've heard here today is reflexivity. So I think that that would echo then the reflexive nature of your work, even though it's not a reflexive topic necessarily.
Thank you so much, Athena. So about PhD, yeah, I think of maybe pursuing a PhD in the future, not right away, just because that's another point of like coming from the global south and pursuing, you know, a master's degree and then trying to stay in academia. We face many challenges. So in this journey to come to another country, I'd like to establish myself a little bit professionally. And another point is how this field is still growing. So I see an increasing offer of PhD projects that are at this intersection of law, political science, technology, and I'm waiting for the right opportunity. So that's how I'm approaching the issue. I'm going to keep researching regardless of you know, being attached to an institution, to academia. And I think that's another interesting point that I've been learning in my journey, is that we can develop work, you know, policy work. To do that, we need research. And to develop research that is meaningful and impactful, we need to be connected to different stakeholders. So it's something that I've been finding really interesting in Canada, is that I actually think it's a very dynamic environment where people transition between these different domains, and they always, you know, there's a conversation going. So we'll see what's next, but that's it for the PhD part. And for the reflexivity, I totally agree. The way I developed those are just 3 points that I wanted to bring up, more to like raise awareness and maybe, you know, inspire you, and, you know, see if it sparks something in you. There are many other results of this research. in the chapter, we talk more about it. And basically what we did is we try to cluster the responses from the interviewees and see the main thematics. But there are other interesting points, and they all revolve around this, like, let's not go for techno solutionism, which is very, very good. Like, I'm very hopeful in where we're going.
Noah, you have a question?
Yes, and it actually also connects to the reflexivity that was just mentioned. So just us as like the YRN network, we were like, when we were like setting out our strategic plan, we were talking about how to be more like reflexive about, the history of European studies, the history of science. And like, so I was just wondering, especially for Athena, because you talked about it, if you have some sources concerning that, we would very, very glad to take them, because we try to be as reflective as possible in our network and also touch upon issues that are often, not touched upon, because, European studies is often very Eurocentric and not very critical. But we try to open that door as well. So yeah, if anyone has some sources, I think we would all be very appreciative.
Yeah, I can send an email afterwards. I don't have the books right next to me, but I do teach a class at the for the incoming doctoral students, a foundational course in sociological theory. And I have one text, which is the foundational theorists, the typical sociological canon. And then I have one textbook that looks at Southern theory that brings in voices from the global South that have typically been excluded from the sociological canon. Then I talk about processes of knowledge construction. And then, I'm sorry, my 3-year-old is playing. I thought I chose the most private room in the house, but clearly it's not at the moment. And then I also accompany the class with a third reading of a textbook, which is Research and Reconciliation, which then brings in Indigenous perspectives of ceremony related to knowledge production and the relationality of knowing according to Indigenous ways. So I can send you those references. And I find that you mentioned that sometimes European studies isn't necessarily reflective. And I wonder if it is when it comes to considerations of power or the recognition of power. But I think that interrogating that power is where it may fall short. And so I think we are going through a surgence of what it means to shift that power balance. And there's, I think Fazila was talking, it creates a lot of polarized discourses and dynamics. So being reflexive is truly key to that. And I think also just being culturally, the value of cultural humility is also important here. So I can send you those references after this, because I don't have them here.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Fazila, did you have a question or a thought?
Not at this point, no. But
sorry, just noticing your mic was.
Happy to listen. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of convenient, because I had a question for you in any case.
For me, okay.
Because I also am really interested in populism, and you bring up a lot of interesting stuff in talking about the relative dynamics of Italy and Turkey, but the sort of consistent discourses involved in both. And one thing I've kind of wondered for a while, but I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to articulate this as well as it sounds in my head, but I would want your perspective on if you think for populism to thrive, the society in question requires almost a kind of comfort, almost a kind of security. And that might be an explanation for why it seems to be this really powerful dynamic in Europe, but it sort of doesn't seem to have the same life force in other parts of the world. And I guess what I mean by comfort and security is, does that rhetoric of, we have our in group and you have this out group, and we have to preserve something that's somehow being disrupted, or in some sense, does that require or necessitate that the country in question, or the society in question, is in the sort of traditional position of power? Like the EU, Europe is sort of traditionally more secure in a lot of ways. So do you think it's almost, I guess, populism is a product of that insecurity? I don't know if this is all making sense, but I would just be kind of curious for your perspectives on that, and if that makes sense in a Turkish context as well.
Okay, so in the Turkish case, well, one of the explanations of the resurgence to power of the AKP as a populist actor is that it gave back voice and visibility to sectors of societies that were marginalized by the previous elites, political elites and societal elites. So regarding interrogating power, that's one thing. So those elites were comfortable in their power structure, but in a way, it made it. How can I say? They facilitated this change in the country in a way through their being so attached to their power and through not being more inclusive and not being more open to change in their way. They thought that they could preserve their power as it was for decades all over. So in a way, the AKP, the support that they got in their first years, also from transversally from different sectors of society, is because they were seen as a force that might have shaked the power foundations of the old elites. But then what happened that they just got more powerful, and they set on the power structure that were constructed before them, and they become even more radicalized in this respect. So when you talk about security, if it's a sense of security, I'm not sure, because I see Italy and I saw the resurgence of populist right-wing parties there. And most of their supporters are people that are having also economic troubles, and they don't feel secure, at least in their declarations. So I guess it's a very composite picture, and it's needs to be contextualized. Depends on where you are and what is the background and all the surroundings of the context. I guess it's not an easy answer that I can give, I guess.
No, fair enough. Yeah, it's a bit of an overall, but I like the points you raised. Were there any other questions that anyone else wanted to ask? Because if not, there was one more I wanted to ask you, Athena, going back to your presentation. And so if anyone else, Noah, yeah?
No, feel free to go first. And
okay, I'll try to keep it brief, because I was just really curious, going back to your presentation, Athena, if, you talked a lot about this, you gave those really fascinating accounts of people. I don't remember the exact phrasing now, but a war is not something we want to draw, or it's not beautiful to me or anything like that. It's terrible. And I would really be curious what your perspective of now, specifically in the recent context of the Russia-Ukraine war, and how that's sort of taken over a lot of the European discourse, and has a lot of Europeans very afraid. If I understand it's sort of just happening, it's all very recent, but if you feel from your perspective that Europe's sort of sense of conflict and maybe the way they talk about it, or their almost fetishization of it, might change now that there's such a major war so close to their borders, or if you feel that maybe that's maybe making too much out of the conflict.
I have more questions for you, actually. And as I'm in Canada, right? So you're in London. So I think the discourse is probably different in location and discipline. And and I don't want to take up too much space, but if I feel like as a professor, I'm totally long-winded, so I apologize in advance. But I remember Prince William went on some interview to say that, wow, war is here, and we've never really experienced this dynamic of war before. When, from his perspective, I suppose that's true, but from the perspective of so many people around the world, they have only known war, they have only known displacement, they've only known conflict and people killing each other because of the legacies of colonization that Prince William's family has directly been responsible for. So for him to say that it's now close to home is a reflection of the privilege of him as a European and his European counterparts who have typically been in positions of power. So that's one reaction that I have. I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are. And the second reaction I have is, there's been a lot of discourse in Canada, as I'm sure you've heard in other countries around the world, about because the refugees are blue-eyed and white and blonde-haired and have pale skin, it's tragic. And yet Russia's also been responsible for displacement of refugees from Syria and from Afghanistan, and the world has largely abandoned Afghan refugees at the moment in their time of significant humanitarian, like it is the worst humanitarian crisis in our lifetime. So I think that there's racist underpinnings about who the world can respond to and what war is acceptable and what war is not. And maybe that's a contentious opinion, but that's just within the circles that I frequent, and I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are. And then if I may, I just have one. I'm reminded of a vignette of someone that I worked with as researchers when I was in Rwanda. One of my colleagues said, you weren't here for the past 4 years. You weren't here when we were going through the genocide. The world, the international community was silent when my neighbors were being killed. And now you come here to our country to ask us of our stories for the purposes of promoting your own authorship. And that's a quote that's always stayed with me as researchers. Even if we try to uncover the sad stories, Fazila, you're a journalist, even if you try to uncover the untold stories, you still are part of a system that silences some voices, and we need to ask why that's the case. And then how can we dismantle that? So anyway, baton back to you, Lawrence. I'd be curious to know what the discourse is of war and the war in Ukraine at the moment where you are.
Well, thank you, Athena. I think that is really, I feel happy with asking my question, because exactly you sort of touch on a lot of those, precisely those circles you move in. It's sort of why I think your perspective on this is so interesting. And I would tend to agree. I mean, it's not an original statement, but yeah, I think there's a fundamental hypocrisy to the sort of European reaction, both the refugees and also just the sort of discourse around the war itself. But at the same time, I find it interesting because, yeah, being in London right now, and I'm actually German American, so my family is all back in Berlin. And it's definitely surreal for a lot of people. And the memory of the Second World War sort of might feel like ancient history, or not ancient, but it might feel distant, but I think it's on a lot of people's minds, and that sort of fear of what comes from the East, and just the sort of, mad dictator making war again. And I think it's so easy for people to think that Europe is sort of just a very peaceful metropolitan, place, but I would suggest that there's a kind of deep-seated memory, even if it's somewhat subconscious at times, of the danger in Europe's past. And it's sort of, I'm seeing a lot of that come to the surface now. Sometimes it's in sort of, productive, ethical ways, as in people saying like, oh, we really need to change how we view conflict, and we have to recognize this. We are being hypocritical. Like, some Europeans are reacting with recognition of that hypocrisy, and like, oh, why were we ignoring Chechnya and Afghanistan and Syria when now it seems so much real? Well, at the other side, there's also, of course, a maybe darker, more malicious reaction of more of a fortress mentality, and more just kind of directly concerned with stopping Putin and kind of controlling and winning, essentially, which is understandable in the sort of on the ground realities, but it's also, I worry about where that might head in the next, year, 5 years, 10 years, although it's too soon to say.
So if I may, just one comment in response to that. Something that I have had conversations with colleagues from Germany in Canada about this very dynamic, and also the parallels of the Canadian lack of Canadian consciousness to confront the realities of the Indigenous people's genocide. I think Germany, in the education system, as I understand it, Germans grew up with understanding their role, their collective role in World War II, which Canada has yet to try to operationalize. And I think the world could learn a lot from Germany about the role of collective consciousness in education and community landscapes, and in order to prevent future atrocities. And I think it's a timely moment. So I have no question for you, just a comment and appreciation for some of the things that you've just mentioned based on your own Germanness.
Thanks. Noah, I pass it over to you then.
Yeah, I really think this conversation is super interesting. Just I grew up in the Austrian school system, so we had the same kind of like reflective process. So it was always very interesting to then go to Canada and see like the lack thereof in the Canadian school system. But that being said, I just wanted to have a final question for Amanda, because our topic is, where are you going, Europe? And I think one topic that we haven't talked a lot about is the climate crisis. And I know that Mila is working a lot also on like how to tackle the climate crisis using AI. I myself don't know a lot about how that works. So I wanted to ask Amanda if she could maybe give us a brief sketch of like what AI is going to do in all of that, because I think it's really interesting, and we've talked about it, but not in that context yet.
Thank you for the question. I can talk a little bit about it. It's not my topic of research, but it's so nice to witness how this is approached in at Mila, because before that I didn't know that there were so many people in artificial intelligence engaged in developing AI systems that could help solve these issues. And there's so many things you can do with the data we have on the environment. So one interesting project, if we want to talk about how the AI world can really open up and communicate to society, there's a really nice project by Mila. I'm going to write in the comments. It's called "This Climate Doesn't Exist." Basically, they used artificial intelligence to generate images, and you can go in the, I'm going to leave the website there, to show how climate catastrophes would look like in different cities around the world. So I went in it and I saw how, for example, floodings would affect the main avenue in São Paulo, which is like the major city in Brazil. Really interesting research that opens up the field to and does this work of awareness raising somehow. But then you also have very technical solutions that AI can enable for the climate crisis, using data and, for example, predicting climate situations. This could be very valuable for places. Think of Brazil and other global south places where all the infrastructure, not all the infrastructure, but most of the infrastructure is not that robust and is not that ready for big climate events. And we have very precarious infrastructure too, with people living in by places that were forests before, and then there's landslides and floodings every year. We know it's a seasonal thing, but how can we mitigate this damage or the risks to lives, and then maybe those technologies come into place in that context? So I think it can be a good thing. And another point that it's kind of controversial is that, okay, but artificial intelligence uses electricity, computing power and all that. So how do we reconcile these two things? And research in AI is also evolving to trying to use less data, less energy. So there's many, and it's like it's part of the whole conversation about this. And I think there are interesting developments there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. Also, the link, I just Googled it and I shared it in the chat, what you talked about, and it's a really interesting website. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, kind of mind blowing. I feel like I'm gonna need to play around with that for at least an hour after this. All the places I've ever lived. But no, thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you everyone else. Unless there's any further questions or anything else anyone wants to raise. It's such a shame, because just the idea, yeah, going back to this, the memory politics of Germany and the memorization and the spaces. Could talk about that for hours, but I have to call it quits to the conversation at some point. So I just want to thank everyone once again for participating, and thank you to our speakers, and thank you to our guests. I think this was a really amazing conversation, and we heard a lot of great perspectives here today. And yeah, I think Ann-Kathrin, Noah, and I, what we basically had in mind with this event was just, I think Noah mentioned it earlier, just opening the door a little bit to a broader conversation of Europe and of, you know, what it means to be a young researcher, and to just, yeah, start that conversation. And in that, I think we succeeded, and I'm yeah, personally very happy. So yeah, thank you again, and everyone. And with if that's all, I hope everyone has a great week and a great weekend. All the best.
Thank you
Bye,
so much.
everyone.
Bye.